Before we start the podcast, we wanted to let you know about WestOS. If you're a teacher or pupil at a school in Scotland, then you now have access to hundreds of quality assured video lessons created by teachers to support your remote learning. You should be able to find WestOS within the app library of Glow, where you can add the tile to your own personal launchpad. Click on the tile and you'll have immediate access to stream lessons in every area of the Scottish curriculum, with video lessons already available for biology at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Now let's get on with the podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Lecky textbooks, revision guides and practice papers, everything you need to learn, review and prepare for your senior phase assessments. Browse the books at www.leckyscotland.co.uk and get 40% off using the discount code LeckyPodcast40. You can now also collect Young Scot reward points by using the codes within the description of each episode to claim discounts and rewards on their website www.young.scot.
So it did look as if I was trying to protect the giraffes from COVID-19.
In this episode, we have the privilege of sitting down with a true luminary in the world of science in Scotland. She's not just a scientist, she's a visionary leader, a trailblazer, and a passionate advocate for the advancement of veterinary research. Joining us is Professor Julie Fitzpatrick, the Chief Scientific Advisor for Scotland and the CEO of the renowned Mordun Research Institute. Her work extends far beyond the lab as she tirelessly champions the importance of science in solving global challenges, from safeguarding animal welfare to ensuring food security and human health. In today's conversation, we'll delve deep into Professor Fitzpatrick's remarkable journey, her pivotal role in providing vital scientific advice to the First Minister, and how her work at Mordun is contributing to a safer, healthier world for us all.
Yes, well, hello, I'm Julie Fitzpatrick and I have a number of different roles. I'm Chief Scientific Advisor for Scotland and I do that 3 days a week, but I'm in a seconded position from my other post where I'm Scientific Director and Chief Executive of the Mordun Group of Companies and Charities. And Mordun undertakes work looking at preventing infectious diseases of livestock species, and that's cattle, sheep, pigs, poultry, and aquaculture species. And then my third sort of role is that I also have a chair in food security at the University of Glasgow. So I have a sort of combination of different posts that I focus on.
What is the Chief Scientific Advisor and what does an average day look like in that role?
Yeah, it's a really interesting job. And my role as the Chief Scientific Advisor is that I provide the government, both politicians and policymakers, evidence and data and advice about scientific subjects. And my particular role is that I cover the general science area, which is really the umbrella of science across all scientific disciplines. Now, what I should say is clearly I'm not an expert on all scientific disciplines, but what I feel I can do is source information from our various networks across Scotland and further afield when we require scientific evidence and advice. And so it's my job really to make sure that we source the best information, whether that's from within government, out with government, or even internationally, so that we can help to make our policy decisions based on science, robust science evidence wherever possible.
How do you go from being Julie in the biology class at school to that Chief Scientific Advisor role?
Well, it's a very good question. And I think what I would be absolutely clear about is I had absolutely no idea when I was sitting at school studying various science subjects that I would ever become the Chief Scientific Advisor. So I don't think it was ever on my career path or even prospects. So I suppose when I was at school, I was really, really interested in animals, all sorts of animals, pet animals, farm animals, wild animals. And my only aim really was to get into vet school and to become a vet, which I was very fortunate and I did. And I did that because I was really fascinated, not just in the animals themselves, but how the animals worked, why they worked, why their bodies function as they do, why they behave as they do. And of course, that's really all about biology. And I've continued that interest as a vet in biology, in terms of research, development, commercialization. And I've been really fortunate that in addition to becoming a vet and working as a veterinary practitioner, I then went on to have a research career focusing on animals and particularly livestock, those animals that are kept for food production. So that's always been my particular interest. I suppose, how did I ever end up then as the chief scientific advisor? In my role at Moredun, I was involved in leading the research into some policy relevant areas for Scottish Government, which includes preventing disease in animals by vaccination and using diagnostic tests. So I was used to working with lots of people across Scottish Government, and then I was approached when the chief scientist job came up and asked if I might be interested in that. So I felt it was a stage of my career that I was really interested in widening out my experience in science and trying to provide that networking, which I think is so important in advising government in so many different areas and platforms.
And you've already, I guess, touched on it a little bit, but there obviously must be a huge amount that crosses your desk with that kind of overall umbrella scientific role. And as you kind of alluded to, obviously there is a bit of research to be done there. How do you manage that and kind of stay across the detail of such wide-ranging topics?
Yeah, we have a team. We are part of the Scott Science Initiative, which is a science and innovation platform which has been developed across the whole Scottish Government. And we have formed that because there are over 700 scientists who are directly employed within the government. And these are in areas of marine science, environmental science, transport, engineering, etc. So there's a huge amount of science ongoing in government anyway. So it's very much a matter of us identifying the teams where the science is being undertaken and making sure that we seek out that information as much as we can. But of course, Scotland, we're really lucky that we have a really wide variety of organisations who are producing research outputs. So those include some of our agencies, such as the Food Standards Scotland and SEPA, the Environment Protection Agency, and Nature Scot. That's just some of our agencies within Scotland. We then have the institutes, the Safari Institutes, and Moredun, the one that I direct, is one of those. And of course, we have amazing universities and colleges, about 19 universities, if I'm correct, and I think about 26 colleges. And then we also have research and development, which is ongoing in our industries and businesses across Scotland. So we're a relatively small country, but we've got lots of science ongoing, and we are really outstanding in terms of scientific inventions. And so I think that networking opportunity is perhaps slightly easier to do in Scotland because we are relatively well joined up. So when we're looking for evidence to support our policies, that's where we go about seeking that advice. Sometimes it's quite challenging because in this particular job, there's quite a demand to provide advice and evidence quite quickly. And that's because the policy demands are quite short term. Whereas I suppose in my background, I've been more involved in the fact that undertaking research and delivering research can sometimes be quite a long-term endeavour. So it's a bit of a mixture of understanding the length of time research takes, but also trying to get outputs that politicians and policymakers need relatively quickly.
We've previously had Sheila Volis and Jason Leach in the podcast. How closely do you work with them and other government advisors then, and what sort of advice do you find yourself and the team providing to, say, the First Minister and the government?
I know both Jason Leach and Sheila Voss very well. If I start with Sheila, because Sheila is a vet, so she's a friend and colleague of mine, and I would speak, really regularly to Sheila about areas around animal health and welfare. We're particularly interested at the moment on the ongoing epidemic, even pandemic of avian influenza in our bird species at the moment. And that's keeping Sheila, as the Chief Veterinary Officer, very busy indeed. And I'm kind of interested in the scientific aspects of some of the disease control scenarios, because we're obviously in government, we're always looking out as to how we can best control diseases in animals, but also the potential risk, and it's low at the moment, of some of these diseases transferring from animals into humans and being the source of future pandemics. So one of the committees that I sit on is the Standing Committee for Pandemic Preparedness within government. And that brings together people who had experience in COVID-19 pandemic and how we plan better to deal with future challenges, how we make sure that we maintain those lessons learned and translate them into being prepared for almost anything that might happen in the future. And interestingly, that's really where I came across Jason Leach, because he had a very important role in communications around the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think he was a very clear and strong voice to the public about what the Scottish Government in particular was doing in terms of following the science and undertaking some of the policy decisions around that area. So I was fortunate that I was, in my role as Chief Scientific Advisor, I did attend some of the SAGE meetings, the UK government meetings, scientific advice for governments in emergencies. And so I was involved in some of those meetings and then helping to translate some of those discussions into the Scottish committees, which were also looking obviously at the Scottish response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So came across Jason on a number of occasions there, mainly working remotely using Teams, as everyone else has been doing over the last couple of years. But nice to be able to meet Jason and Sheila and many others across government now face to face.
Tell us, what's it like to sit in one of the SAGE meetings? What are those meetings like? Obviously, over that period of time, a lot of them were online. What do they feel like? How would you describe them?
Yeah, I think they were extremely interesting meetings, extremely well chaired by Patrick Vallance, who was the Chief Scientific Advisor for the UK. And I think what really impressed me was the very calm and considered way that the evidence was discussed and decisions on what advice should be provided to the relevant groups who were interested in the outcomes of the meetings. The meetings were minuted very carefully, as indeed were all of the scientific documents which were presented at SAGE. So it was very much a recorded meeting where the scientific evidence was considered incredibly carefully. And of course, that then allowed the setup of a number of different subgroups and other committees who then actively sought the evidence that was needed during those very difficult first few months of the pandemic. Of course, SAGE continued on until relatively recently, and I was very impressed indeed at the number and the quality of the scientists who were involved in the discussions.
That's all right. Do you want to take
Sorry?
that? I can.
No, it's fine.
That's right.
It's not urgent, thank you.
That's okay. It's not Patrick Vallance or...
No.
Yeah, they were all quite surreal times, I guess, through the whole pandemic. But what's been the most surreal day as Chief Scientific Advisor?
Well, I think I probably have had a few, but my most surreal visit was actually to Edinburgh Zoo. And obviously, being a vet, I've been to Edinburgh Zoo many times because I think it's a fantastic zoological collection. But this time I went in my role as Chief Scientific Advisor because the zoo isn't just there for entertainment or for visits by families and individuals, although that's a fantastic purpose in its own right. But it's a real centre of scientific learning and recording of scientific information and data. So I really went to the zoo to hear about their genetics. They're trying to understand the genomes of their different wildlife species, and they've got specialized breeding programs for a number of the animals that they keep in the zoo. But my surreal moment was that I was allowed to visit the giraffes who live at the very top of the hill at Edinburgh Zoo. I don't know if you've been, but they've got a fantastic view over the city.
They do.
And because I was the chief scientist, not only did I get to see the giraffes, but I was allowed to climb up onto a platform to feed the giraffes with some sort of delicious green stuff. So when the giraffes saw me arriving, they sort of sped along as fast as giraffes can go to the flat platform that I was standing on, and I was able to feed them, which was so exciting, I have to say. And it was only afterwards somebody took a photograph of me, and I was wearing my COVID mask. So it did look as if I was trying to protect the giraffes from COVID-19, but I wasn't. They were at no risk from me. But it shows that I was actually there, just after we were allowed to go out and about after the the COVID pandemic. But it was very interesting to see the giraffes, but also to hear from the staff within the zoo about, their dedication to maintaining the diversity of species that we have right across the world. The zoo, like many of our other collections in Scotland, like the Royal Botanic Gardens, they don't just focus on what they're doing for the Scottish people or for the UK people, but they're really working internationally to make sure that biodiversity and zoological species are protected wherever possible.
You mentioned obviously avian flu and the potential for further zoonotic transmission, and the need to kind of be aware of these things. What can you tell us about the avian flu at the moment?
Yeah, I mean it's very prevalent at the moment, and there are continuing outbreaks in various poultry establishments right across the UK. I think the prevalence has dropped slightly recently, but it's still an issue. And we obviously have avian influenza in some of our wild bird populations as well, which of course, is very concerning for the wild birds themselves. So there's still debates ongoing about how to best control the disease and other options that might be considered going forward, such as vaccination. But some of these are extremely difficult to implement with wild species. There have been studies showing, obviously, that avian influenza, can infect other species. But again, that doesn't necessarily lead to an immediate and major concern of transmission to the human population.
I guess you can't really ask wild populations to turn up at the local town hall for a vaccination, then, no?
No, it's certainly a challenge, and I think what I'm particularly interested in is this sort of One Health agenda. And I quite like that terminology because I do believe that human health is, linked to animal health, plant health, and increasingly environmental health. So many of the pathogens that we know about, or maybe even the pathogens that are yet to evolve or that we don't know about yet, they live in very complex ecosystems and transfer of these pathogens between these different species is extremely important. It's important that we understand it, because if we can understand it better, then hopefully we can make interventions that control some of these zoonotic or One Health pathogens. So it's an area that I think has been raised because of a number of disease outbreaks over the years. And I think it's something that our new technologies in science can really help us to prepare better and to understand how to prevent transmission of pathogens in these different ways.
Maybe you could just expand on that a wee bit more around this idea of One Health. How do we aspire to go down that path?
Yeah, I think the challenge in One Health is making sure that all of the players do come together where that overlap happens. So that means the medical science and the biomedical science. So it's really important that people who are involved in protecting human health and preventing human disease are involved. And of course, there's so much work potentially that can be done in that area. So it's trying to make sure that some of our medical scientists are really prepared to focus down and understand some of the links that we see as animal and veterinary scientists in the animal field and that the plant scientists see in their area. And then one of the reasons that we talk about environmental science is that's how the pathogens transfer. So we were able to detect coronavirus RNA in our wastewater in Scotland. So that was an amazing example of being able to detect where pathogens were, how they might even be evolving, because we were able to trace down those pathogens in our wastewater systems. Another area, though, that I think One Health is really important is trying to address the problem of antimicrobial resistance, because sometimes it's seen as a chronic problem. We've known for a long time that AMR is a big problem, but it's also pretty acute at the moment, because it is estimated that there will be a very substantial number of deaths right across the world because of resistance to some of our main antibiotics that are used in humans. So one of the ways of addressing that is to understand how we use antimicrobial drugs, particularly antibiotics, but antimicrobials are broader. It includes drugs that we use for parasites, for example. But if we can understand how we use them in our animals and in our plants, which we sometimes use similar drugs, then we can start to reduce the usage of antimicrobials and then reduce the risk of transmission of those resistant pathogens into the human populations. And in answer to your question about where does Scotland sit in this, I think it's in a very strong internationally scientifically renowned area. We're good on all of these areas of science. And I think it's an area that we have over the years contributed to very significantly indeed. And I also see One Health as sort of a global One Health issue, because in my role as a researcher and as head of a research institute, I've been very fortunate to work quite a bit in lots of continents right across the world, but particularly in Africa and East Africa. And in some of these countries, One Health is even more important because people live very close to their animals in some of these societies. Some of them live literally in the same physical building. So there might be humans living in one side of a building and their animal species, which could be chickens or goats or sheep, in another part. So in some of the developing world, that interaction between animals and humans is really tight. And that does increase the chances of transmission of pathogens. Also, the increase of kind of One Health issues increases with migration of humans, with war and disruption, people moving areas, anything that disrupts the normal way that we live in concert with the animals around us. So that's why I think it's got a really big, important focus globally as well as within our more local environments.
I wonder then, Would you say that there is an argument and that it's quite important then for young people going through school to keep their biological knowledge as wide as possible while they're still at school, to build that wider picture? So rather than, say, specialising in just human biology at school because you want to go and do medicine, maybe build a broader foundation on which to build with that idea of One Health in mind.
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I know some people do study biology because they require it to go on to the profession or the discipline that they're particularly interested in. But I'm a great believer in science for science sake, whether that's biology or physics or chemistry or engineering, because I think there's just so much you can do when you have a biological training. And to me, it just is relevant to almost every aspect of life, all the way from drug discovery to engineering. There's a big thing at the moment about calling it sort of engineering biology. And so that's combining the use of things like, artificial intelligence, computing science, engineering biological molecules so they can be even more useful. So a good example of engineering biology is developing vaccines. So we saw that during the COVID-19 era, and we see that in our animal vaccine at work. So I really love that idea of multidisciplinary, engineering biological systems. And there's so many examples of that and so many different career paths. Because again, engineering biology, I think, is really coming up the agenda about land use, renewable energies, biomass being another example of one of the potential feedstocks for energy and for novel chemical production. So biology is a subject that I think has just got so many applications. And I think the main thing for school people to think about is not to think about biology as a narrow subject, but as a platform on which to build so many other potential jobs and careers. And I think the sort of green economy, the way Scotland is going and most of the rest of the world is going to be huge demand for people who have understanding of biological systems.
Absolutely. Bringing the conversation back to yourself, as well as being Chief Scientific Advisor, you obviously split your time between that role and your role at the Morden Institute. What can you tell us about the Morden Institute?
Yeah, the Morden Institute has been around for over 100 years. It was started in 1920. So it was kind of between the war years, and it was because food production was thought to be, and probably in my view still is, very important for the country as a whole. And it's interesting because quite a few other institutes were also set up round about the same time. So it was a time of kind of scientific investment in Scotland. And I'm delighted to say that the Safari Institutes, which also include places like the James Hutton Institute, SRUC, the Rowett Research Institute, BIOS, and the Royal Botanic Gardens, still work on those kind of policy relevant areas. So from Morden's perspective, we are experts, our staff, scientific staff are experts in infectious organisms, and animals have a lot of them: viruses, bacteria, parasites, and protozoans. So a very wide number of different pathogens causing significant disease. Now, some of these are not exotic diseases or pandemic diseases. They're what we call endemic or production diseases. So they're there quite commonly. And these are the ones that really affect animals' welfare because they're stuck with them and they reduce the production of the animals. And that has an impact on greenhouse gases because they're not being productive, but they're producing greenhouse gas. So our aim at Morden is to prevent disease rather than waiting for it to occur and then using antibiotics. We try to prevent it. And in order to do that, you need to be able to diagnose it. So we've got new diagnostic tests that help us detect disease. And then our major focus is on vaccination so that we can prevent the diseases happening altogether. So in fact, many of the vaccines that are used across the world at the moment were actually developed by Mordan, including vaccines against diseases such as pneumonia or other forms of reproductive disease, and also vaccines against parasites, which is a particularly big challenge. So those are the kind of areas we work on. It's quite long-term research, but the aim is to get the research into practice. We need to get the outputs commercialised and then used in livestock production across the world, which we've been successful in doing.
And of course you're based in just outside Edinburgh.
Yeah, just outside Edinburgh, and we are in the Easterbush area, which is a real epicentre of animal science excellence. We're very close to the Roslin Institute, which you will have heard of, and many of your school school people will also have heard of it because of Dolly the sheep, the first cloned sheep. So Roslin tend to very much work on the host animal, the animal species, and then we're just very close to them, but we're working on the pathogens, on the infections. And really, the two come together quite often when we're trying to do things like breeding animals that are resistant to disease. But the Easterbush area has about 4,000 scientists who are involved in environmental, ecological, bioscience areas. So it is a real centre of excellence.
I was fortunate enough to attend a meeting there at Morden last year, and driving in, I was amazed. It was almost like an industrial park filled with all these huge scientific names. So yeah, I can believe there's that many scientists. It's a real hive of activity.
It's brilliant, and I think the thing is, once you've got these centres, that we've now got the science park, which is part of our kind of commercial activity, but it means we've got 23 scientific companies on our park, and many of them are working in environmental science. Some of them are crop science. We've got potato scientists. We've got people who are working on international development and science, and so we create a community of scientists. And I do believe that we're in the era of big science. The days of an individual scientist going it alone and coming up with amazing outputs is really gone. It is all about interdisciplinary science, people working together, and big science needs big teams. And even in the area that we're talking about with Morden, I see Morden as very much being a centre for all of the universities and colleges across Scotland. So, I have to declare an interest that I'm a Glasgow graduate, and Glasgow again has some amazing biomedical and veterinary science. Stirling has some great areas in aquaculture. So it's trying to make sure, I think, that we're all linked together through collaboration where that's appropriate. Some of the organisations, we also compete against each other for funding, and that's good as well. But we need to decide when to compete and when to collaborate. But I do see science going forward as being increasingly collaborative and increasingly multi and interdisciplinary in its nature. And I think Scotland's always been very good at doing that. We've drawn down a lot of money from Horizon Europe in particular, but from all sorts of international sources. And it's big science that's going to get the funding for the future.
Collaboration's a theme that's come up a number of times through the podcast. You've obviously got a leadership role in Morden. What makes a good leader, do you think?
Yes, it's interesting. I think from my perspective at Morden, one of the things that I'm most fortunate about is I've got some fantastic scientists to lead, and I think having scientists who are really top of their field, working together. And I think it's really important that everybody is working towards the same vision and strategy. And I think being a leader is more than just developing a strategy along with others. Obviously strategies have to be written collectively because it is a team. In our case, it's a whole institute has to broadly agree which direction we're going in. So I think the role of a leader is not just writing the strategy, it's writing the delivery, it's writing the operational aspects about how to deliver the strategy. And that can take many, many years depending on what you do. And so to me, it doesn't sound very exciting, but I think the qualities of a leader are a little bit about focus. So you've got to be able to focus on what it is you think you're trying to do. And then I think that requires patience, because sometimes things don't work out as quickly as you want and you need to apply patience. And then my other P is persistence, because I think if I had a word to describe the challenges of leadership and how to address it, it is about perseverance and being persistent. Because if you believe that you're on the right tracks, you're doing the right thing, you've got the right people, then sometimes you have to be quite persistent and try to overcome hurdles and continue to try to deliver what that vision is. And so I think that leadership role is about trying to bring people with you, but understanding that sometimes you do need to provide people with a focus and a vision so that they can become part of that bigger system.
And with that, you obviously work incredibly hard. I guess one of the things I'm interested in is how do you switch off and look after yourself as a person rather than a directorate more than a chief scientific advisor?
Yeah, well, I suppose mainly family, and I extend the family out to our dogs and walking the dogs, which takes up quite a lot of time.
What are your dogs called?
We've got a Labrador called Darcy. She's 6 years old, and a Border Terrier called Dora, and she's 12 years old. And we've always walked them a lot, but particularly during COVID-19, we're fortunate that we were near the Pentland Hills. So we spent a lot of time up on the hills looking down on the city, and it was fantastic. But that is my main method of relaxation. And then I've got another hobby, but I don't know if it's relaxing, and that's golf, which I've taken up in later life once my children had grown up and I had a bit more time.
What do you play off?
I play off 36.
Okay.
So I'm very pleased that Scottish Golf now has extended the handicap system, I think, out to something like 60 or something. So I play off 36, and so I'm very much still working my way slowly along the handicap. I love watching golf. I thought the Scottish Open was fantastic with both Bob McIntyre from Open and Rory McIlroy from Northern Ireland, competing for the win, and that was fantastic. So it is I think golf is like another version of walking, which I quite enjoy as well.
Yeah, you also need perseverance for that game too. Yeah. When you're not playing golf or walking the dogs, do you get much time to read? And have you got any science or biology related books that you'd recommend to anyone?
Yes, I do read, and I tend to read sort of novels rather than anything terribly exciting. But there's two books that I have just bought because I'm going to read them on my holidays, which are coming up. And one is called Weapons of Math Destruction, and it is about artificial intelligence and what it can do in terms of bias and interpretation of evidence and facts. So I think that's interesting. And the other book that I have bought for my holidays is called Blue Machine, which is about the importance of understanding why the seas, which occupy the vast majority of the Earth's surface, why they are so important in driving everything that we do on Earth and in life.
They sound pretty good recommendations. In fact, one I'm looking forward to that's coming out shortly from Eve Poole is a book also in AI called Robot Souls. So I'm quite looking forward to that. I think she'll be quite interesting in talking about that. You've obviously worked with a huge number of scientists, and we've talked about the need for collaboration, and we've talked about how, as Chief Scientific Officer, it's very much about getting the right scientists in the room to give that expert advice. What Scottish scientists should young people be aware of, and who do you think is currently out there inspiring you and might inspire others as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the one I would have to pick out is Professor Sir Aziz Sheikh, who was knighted just about a year ago, I believe. And he is the head of the Usher Institute at the University of Edinburgh. And I've been very fortunate to work quite closely with Aziz because he was involved in a program called Eve 1 and Eve 2 programs. And that was collecting data relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what was just amazing about the work that Aziz did with his colleagues was they managed to collect information about a very high proportion of all of the people, the patients in Scotland, from GP practices across the whole country. And then they were able to relate that to their vaccination status and to the outcomes of COVID-19 in different types of populations. So they were able to follow the immune response to COVID-19, to the disease and to vaccination, and also to follow the outcomes of things like pregnancy in COVID-19 and what the outcomes were in people who were vaccinated and not vaccinated. So he just led an amazing piece of work and was knighted as a result of that work. I mean, it sounds too little really to say it was just that. I mean, he's had an entire career of amazing quantitative analytical science, but I thought that was just such a brilliant example of what science can do. And, you know, I think he is somebody that people who have heard about him and know about him would just be so impressed at what he's managed to do internationally as well. You know, so much input into data science and evidence across many different countries and continents.
Wow. And I guess the last question really is, what advice do you have for any young people considering a career in science?
I think I would say that science is an incredibly interesting and broad area. And I think it's really important to try to experience the breadth of jobs and careers that you can have within science. I think for younger people, it's still too easy to think that science is very much about working in a laboratory or focusing down on something very specific. And it isn't. I mean, science is everything from that sort of lab-based science to working outside to applying science into solutions in engineering, in marine, in medicine. So it's trying to see the breadth of science and really seeing that the career opportunities are huge. I mean, they're particularly strong in some areas of science at the moment, simply because of the advances that we're seeing in medicine, where we've got, you know, medical imaging, medical instrumentation, robotics. These are just examples in biology linking with other types of science. But I just think the science careers in things like the built environment, in building houses, insulating houses, and making sure that we have net zero approaches to development, renewable energies, carbon capture and storage. I mean, it's just too many to mention. So I think the thing is for young people to try and get out there and try and hopefully expose themselves to some of the opportunities that are out there. I have to say one of the best ways of doing that without travelling too far is to go to the science centres in Scotland, one in Glasgow, one in Aberdeen, one in Dundee and one in Edinburgh. And they are really good examples of the breadth of science. Some of them are funded by industry. Some of the exhibits are funded by industry. And it isn't all just about the fun of science, which they obviously focus on, but it's about the educational aspects and the careers of a number of different scientific areas. So I would really recommend visiting science centres to get a feel for the broader opportunities.
Fantastic. Professor Julie Fitzpatrick, thank you very much for joining us in the Higher Biology podcast.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks to you for listening, and also to Lecky for helping to make these podcasts a reality. Professor Fitzpatrick and those she works with play a crucial role in shaping government policies and decisions by ensuring that they're grounded in sound scientific principles, which ultimately have a direct impact on all our lives. You can hear more inspirational stories like hers and more curriculum-focused support by subscribing to the Higher Biology podcast on whichever platform you get your podcasts.